Someone who can't stop comparing themselves scrolls through their phone and within minutes has measured themselves against a dozen different lives. Someone's vacation photos make them feel like their life is too small. Someone's career achievement makes them feel like they're falling behind. Someone's relationship makes them question their own. Someone's body makes them scrutinize theirs. Someone's happiness makes them wonder why they can't feel that way. And if you've ever been that person, if you've ever closed an app feeling worse about yourself than when you opened it, then you know this isn't about admiration or inspiration. This is about using other people's lives as a measuring stick for your own worth. This is about a mind that has learned to determine its value through constant external comparison. And that comparison, no matter how many times you win it, always leaves you feeling like you're losing. People who can't stop comparing themselves carry a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of competition, but the exhaustion of never being able to simply exist as they are. Every moment becomes an assessment. Every person they encounter becomes a data point in an endless evaluation of whether they measure up. They walk into a room and immediately scan for who's more successful, more attractive, more confident, more everything. They hear about someone's achievement and immediately calculate where they stand in relation to it. They see someone's life and use it to judge their own as lacking. And the strangest part is that this comparison never makes them feel better. Even when they come out ahead in that mental ranking, the relief is temporary. Because comparison is an addiction that requires constant feeding. And no matter how many times you win, there's always another comparison waiting. Another person to measure against. Another way to find yourself insufficient. So many I seeks. Why do you care so much what other people are doing? Why can't you just focus on yourself? And you don't know how to explain that you're not choosing to care. That the comparison happens automatically, compulsively, before you even realize you're doing it. That your brain has been trained to use other people as mirrors. And in those mirrors, you're always looking for evidence of where you stand. That you've internalized a belief that your value is relative rather than inherent. That being good isn't enough. You have to be better. Better than someone. Better than most people. Better than you were yesterday. And that better is always defined by looking outward rather than inward. By measuring yourself against standards you don't even agree with, but can't stop using anyway. Most people think comparison is natural, maybe even useful for motivation. But people who can't stop comparing understand the truth. It's not motivating. It's paralyzing. It's not inspiring. It's depleting, because when your worth is constantly being measured against others, you never feel secure. You never feel enough. You're only ever as good as your last comparison. And that comparison changes based on who you're looking at, what platform you're on, what mood you're in. You could feel adequate one moment and completely insufficient the next. Not because anything about you changed, but because you encountered someone who has what you don't. And in that encounter, your entire sense of self shifts. Not because of anything real, but because of a mental habit that's become so automatic, you don't even notice it's happening. There is a restlessness in you, a constant searching outside yourself for information about whether you're okay. You can't trust your own assessment of your life. You need external validation, external markers, external proof that you're doing well enough. But the proof is never conclusive, because there's always someone doing better. Always someone who has achieved more, looks better, seems happier, has more of whatever it is you think you're lacking. And so the comparison never ends. It just shifts. Targets. You're not competing against one person. You're competing against everyone. Against the version of everyone they choose to show. Against your imagination of their lives. Against an impossible composite of everyone's best moments, accomplishments, and attributes. And you're measuring your whole reality, including the parts you keep private, against that impossible standard. People who can't stop comparing themselves often carry an invisible curriculum. They know what it's like to feel inadequate in the presence of success that isn't theirs. They know how to smile at someone's good news while internally feeling diminished by it. They know what it's like to scroll social media and feel progressively worse with each post. They know the shame of resenting people for having what they want. They know how to turn celebration into competition without meaning to. They know the exhaustion of keeping mental scorecards that nobody else is aware of. They develop a constant state of evaluation that others mistake for being observant or aware. But this isn't awareness. It's surveillance. They're monitoring everyone around them for information about their own adequacy. And that monitoring is relentless. Research in psychology shows that Social comparison is a natural human tendency. We use others as reference points to understand ourselves. But for some people, this tendency becomes pathological. Constant, automatic, and deeply tied to self. This often develops in environments where a person's value was explicitly or implicitly measured against others. Maybe you grew up being compared to siblings. Maybe your parents held up other children as examples of what you should be. Maybe you were praised only when you outperformed others and criticized when you didn't. Maybe you attended schools or participated in activities where ranking, competing, and being better than others was emphasized. Maybe you absorbed cultural messages that life is a competition and your worth is determined by where you place. In these environments, the child learns that their value isn't intrinsic, it's comparative, and that comparison becomes the lens through which they see themselves forever. There's a particular pain in chronic comparison that's hard to articulate. It's not just feeling bad about yourself, occasionally. It's never being able to feel good about yourself without checking whether you're still ahead of someone else. It's achieving something significant and having the joy immediately contaminated by awareness of someone who achieved more. It's looking at your own life and being unable to appreciate it without measuring it against others. It's the inability to be present in your own experience because you're too busy evaluating how it compares to everyone else's. What makes this particularly cruel is that social media has industrialized comparison. It's created an infinite stream of curated lives to measure yourself against. And your brain doesn't distinguish between reality and performance. It sees someone's highlight reel and compares it to your bio. It sees someone's best moment and compares it to your average day. It sees someone's carefully constructed image and compares it to your unfiltered reality. And in that comparison, you always lose, because you're comparing your whole truth to their partial presentation. But your brain doesn't know that. It just registers. They have something you don't. There's something you're not. And you are, therefore, less than. People who can't stop comparing often develop a complicated relationship with other people's success. They want to be happy for others. They try to be happy for others. But underneath the congratulations is a quiet ache, a feeling of being left behind, of not measuring up, of their own accomplishments being diminished by someone else's. This isn't because they're bad people. It's because their sense of worth has become dependent on relative positioning. When someone raises, they feel like they've fallen, even when nothing about their actual situation has changed. The comparison creates a zero-sum mentality, where someone else's gain feels like their loss. There's also a way that comparison prevents authentic living. When you're constantly measuring yourself against others, you can't make choices based on what you actually want. You make choices based on what will look good in comparison. You pursue things not because they matter to you, but because they're impressive markers others will recognize. You curate your life for an imaginary audience, always aware of how your choices will measure against someone else's. And in that performance, you lose connection with what you actually value, what you actually enjoy, what would actually make you feel fulfilled. Because fulfillment requires internal reference points, and comparison has trained you to only look outward. What people don't understand about chronic comparison is that it doesn't lead to improvement. It leads to paralysis. Because when you're constantly measuring yourself against others, you're either behind and feeling inadequate, or ahead and anxiously protecting your position. Either way, you can't relax. You can't enjoy. You can't be present. You're always in a state of evaluation, of calculation, of determining where you stand. And that state is exhausting. It drains the joy from achievement, because achievement becomes just another data point in an endless comparison rather than something valuable in itself. Sleep often becomes disrupted for chronic comparers, because the mind doesn't stop evaluating when the day ends. They lie awake thinking about people who have more, do more, are more. They replay social interactions, analyzing how they measured up. They rehearse future scenarios where they'll finally pull ahead, or they spiral into anxiety about falling further behind. The comparison continues, even in the space that should be restful, because the habit has become so deeply ingrained that it operates automatically. But here's something people who can't stop comparing need to understand. You're not actually competing with anyone. The race you think you're in doesn't exist, because everyone is running toward different finish lines, operating with different resources, playing different games entirely. You're comparing your chapter 3 to someone else's chapter 20. Your beginning to their middle, your struggle to their success. And none of those comparisons are valid because the contexts are completely different. You're measuring yourself against people whose circumstances, privileges, starting points, and paths are nothing like yours. And in that measurement, you're not getting accurate information about your worth or progress. You're just creating suffering. The path forward isn't about stopping comparison entirely. That's nearly impossible, given how deeply wired it is. The path is about changing what you do with the comparison when it arises, about recognizing it as a habit rather than truth, about questioning whether the standard you're using is even one you care about redirecting your attention from external evaluation to internal assessment. Not, am I doing better than them, but am I doing better than I was? Not do I have what they have, but do I have what I need? Not where do I rank, but am I moving toward what matters to me? Something shifts when people who chronically compare begin to practice what psychologists call internal reference orientation. When they start measuring their progress against their own past rather than against others' present, when they define success by their own values rather than by external markers, when they allow other people's achievements to exist without making them mean something about their own worth. This shift doesn't happen overnight. The comparison habit is strong, but with practice, it's possible to notice the comparison, acknowledge it, and choose not to follow it down the rabbit hole of self-evaluation. To let someone else's success be about them rather than about you. People who work through chronic comparison often discover something liberating, that other people's lives aren't actually as perfect as they appeared, that everyone is struggling with something they don't show, that the people they've been measuring themselves against are also comparing themselves to others and feeling inadequate. That comparison is a game nobody wins, because the rules are designed to keep everyone feeling insufficient. And when they stop playing, when they stop using others as measuring sticks, they finally have space to figure out what they actually want their life to look like. Not what would look good, not what would impress others, but what would feel meaningful to them. And maybe the most important truth of all is this: your worth isn't relative. It's not determined by how you compare to others. It's not increased by being better than someone or decreased by being less than someone. It exists independent of comparison entirely. You have value because you're human, because you're here, because you're trying, and that value doesn't require external validation or comparative ranking. It just is. The system that taught you to measure yourself against others was always flawed, because it created a game where everyone loses, where even winning feels empty because you're immediately looking for the next comparison, where your sense of self is always dependent on external factors you can't control. If you're someone who can't stop comparing yourself, who scrolls and feels inadequate, who measures your worth against others constantly, who can't celebrate your own life without checking how it ranks, then maybe it's time you hear this. You're not in competition with anyone. The life you're building doesn't need to be better than anyone else's. It just needs to be yours. Authentic, aligned with what you actually value. Not what looks impressive from the outside, but what feels meaningful from the inside. The comparison habit is strong. It won't disappear just because you want it to, but you can start noticing it. Start questioning it. Start redirecting your attention when it arises, and slowly, over time, you can build a new way of relating to yourself. One where your worth comes from within rather than from constant external evaluation, where other people's success doesn't diminish yours, where you can appreciate your life without needing it to be better than someone else's. That's not easy. It requires practice, patience, and repeated choice. But it's possible. And it's the only way to stop the exhausting cycle of comparison that keeps you from ever feeling enough. You already are enough. Not compared to anyone. Not ranked against anyone. Just enough. As you are. And that truth is waiting for you the moment you stop looking outside yourself for permission to believe it.